The screaming ripped through the neighborhood before sunrise, not yelling pure terror. I was already at my fence, one hand locked on my dog's collar, watching the woods explode with movement. Dozens of raccoons poured out at once, not confused, not random, focused. They rushed my yard, stopped cold, then split around it like water hitting a wall. My raccoon barriers held. They didn't touch my house. Instead, they flooded straight through the opening the HOA had forced me to remove and straight into Karen's home. Glass shattered, cabinets slammed, alarms wailed. Karen stumbled into the yard, screaming my name, her house crawling behind her. She thought this was an accident. Standing there in the dark, I realized something far worse. This wasn't bad luck. This was cause and effect, and she had just triggered it. Karen didn't show up to talk. She showed up to order. By late morning, she was standing in my driveway, a bright yellow sports car parked behind her like a warning sign no one could miss. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, already shaking her head at my fence. "Those raccoon barriers," she said, pointing like she owned the place, "don't fit the look of this neighborhood. Not unsafe, not illegal. She just didn't like how they looked." Karen was the HOA president of Hunter's Ridge, and everyone knew it. She dressed like she was always heading to a meeting, spoke like every sentence was final, and hid control behind phrases like community standards and property value concerns. She told me raccoons were a normal part of nature, said the HOA didn't allow homeowners to build obstacles that made others uncomfortable. According to her, fences and deterrents made people think something bad was going on here. I told her exactly why the barriers were up. I told her raccoons came out of those woods in groups. I told her once they found a way in, they didn't stop. She smiled, slow and confident. "The board has already approved removal," she said. "It's happening." That was her mistake. She thought rules mattered more than reality. She thought animals followed HOA guidelines. As she turned and walked back to that yellow car, I realized something. Karen believed raccoons were harmless because she'd never given them a reason to prove her wrong. The first notices didn't arrive with threats. They arrived wrapped in politeness. A white envelope on my mailbox. HOA letterhead. Friendly reminder printed in bold at the top. It cited my raccoon barriers as non-compliant exterior features. No fine yet, just a deadline. 7 days to restore visual consistency. I ignored it. 2 days later, Karen showed up again, this time not alone. 2 HOA volunteers stood behind her clipboards, out eyes scanning my fence like inspectors at a crime scene. "You've had time to review the guidelines," she said calmly. "We expect cooperation." I reminded her the barriers were temporary and necessary. I reminded her wildlife came out of those woods every night. I pointed to overturned trash cans up and down the street, claw marks on lids, muddy prints on driveways. She didn't even look. "This isn't about animals," she said. "It's about order." That was the moment I understood the rules didn't exist to solve problems. They existed to enforce obedience. Within a week, the pressure increased. Violation stickers appeared on my gate. Neighbors whispered that Karen was concerned about me. Someone reported my motion lights as disturbing. Still no fine, but the message was clear. Fall in line. The tone changed the moment the board got involved. This time the envelope was thicker. Official. Cold. The HOA cited multiple violations at once, barriers lighting unapproved deterrent materials. The language shifted from suggestions to commands. Failure to comply would result in forced removal and daily penalties. That's when I started documenting everything. Photos, dates, times. Ranger and I walked the fence line every evening. I noted which boards were loose, which latches had fresh scratches, which screws didn't match the others. Karen denied everything. At the next informal review, she sat at the head of the table flanked by board members who barely spoke. She explained that raccoons were a seasonal nuisance and that barriers attracted attention. "They make people think there's danger here," she said. I asked her what she thought would happen if the barriers came down. She smiled, leaned back in her chair, and said, "Then nature takes care of itself." 2 days later, while I was at work, the barriers came down. No notice, no call, just bare fence posts and an open gap leading straight from the woods into my yard. The raccoons came that night. Not one or two, a group. Ranger caught it before I did. His body went stiff, low growl, then chaos. By the time I got the floodlight on, he was already hurt. Bite marks on his side, blood in his fur. The raccoons scattered only after I charged the yard, yelling. At the emergency vet, the words hit harder than any HOA letter. Deep puncture wounds. Risk of infection. He's lucky. I wasn't calm anymore. Back home, I followed the fence with a flashlight. That's when I saw it fresh tool marks. screws removed cleanly, not weathered, not old. And in the mud by the gate hinge a clear shoe print, narrow, sole, athletic tread, the same kind Karen wore every time she inspected my property. This wasn't negligence. This was intentional. I filed a police report. I called animal control. I sent everything to a lawyer. The legal response came back fast and serious. If the HOA had ordered removal, knowing wildlife risks existed, and if that removal led to injury, they were looking at mid-six-figure liability. Not fines, not warnings, real consequences. That night, as Ranger slept bandaged beside me, I rebuilt the barrier stronger, legal documented from every angle. And I sent one final message to the HOA board. You were warned. Any further interference will be treated as deliberate endangerment. They didn't reply. Instead, Karen scheduled an emergency compliance hearing. That's when I knew this was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was about to become very public. The first official response didn't come from the HOA. It came from animal control. 2 officers walked the property with me the next morning, eyes moving between the woods, the open fence line, and Ranger's blood-stained patch of grass. One of them crouched near the gate, ran a finger along the hinge, and frowned. This wasn't knocked loose, he said. Someone took this apart. They photographed everything. The missing screws, the clean cuts, the path leading straight from the tree line into my yard. When I showed them the vet report, bite depth antibiotics, follow-up visits, the tone shifted. This is no longer just wildlife, the senior officer said. This is negligence with consequences. That afternoon, a county code officer called, then a deputy, then my lawyer. Each conversation followed the same pattern, calm at first, then sharp. If the HOA ordered removal of wildlife deterrence after being warned, and that action directly caused injury, the exposure wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a slap on the wrist fine. It was serious. Medical costs, property damage, emotional distress tied to a service animal, and most dangerous of all, for them, documented intent. I didn't threaten. I didn't posture. I simply forwarded everything. Karen responded the only way she knew how. She doubled down. That evening, a notice was taped to my door. Not mailed, taped. Unauthorized reconstruction of removed barriers. Failure to comply will result in HOA-directed remediation. Remediation, that was her word for trespassing. The next morning I installed cameras. Front, back, alley, fence line, every angle covered. I wanted her to make her next move. She didn't disappoint. At 2 a.m., while I was inside on a conference call, my phone buzzed. Motion alert, rear fence. I pulled up the feed. A brightly colored HOA utility truck rolled into the alley behind my house. 2 men stepped out wearing safety vests, with the HOA logo stitched on the chest. They didn't hesitate. No knocking, no checking. Bolt cutters came out. Seconds later, Karen entered the frame. Sunglasses on, hair tight, clipboard in hand. She didn't touch a tool. She didn't have to. She pointed. They cut. They dismantled the barriers piece by piece, stacking them neatly like trophies. One man spray-painted a mark on the ground near the fence post. HOA property, 17 minutes. That's all it took. Before they left, Karen stepped closer to the camera, close enough that I could see her mouth move. I didn't need audio to read it. This ends today. I backed up the footage 3 times. Then I walked outside. The barriers were gone. Again. And this time, the opening was wider, deliberate, inviting. I didn't rebuild them. Instead, I sent the footage to my lawyer, Animal Control the county, and every HOA board member in one email. Subject line, unauthorized entry documented. Within an hour, the replies started. Not from Karen, from the board. Questions, confusion, panic. By 4:00 p.m., a certified letter slid under my door. An emergency compliance hearing had been scheduled for the next morning at the clubhouse. Mandatory attendance. Allegations of hostile conduct and community disruption. Karen wanted a stage. She wanted witnesses. She wanted control. That night, I didn't sleep. Neither did Ranger. At 3:17 a.m., my phone buzzed again. Motion alert. Not my yard. Karen's side of the fence. I opened the feed just in time to see shadows moving at the edge of the woods. More than before, a lot more. Ringed tails, low bodies, coordinated movement. They reached the gap where my barriers used to be, paused, then flowed through it past my house toward hers. I stood at the fence holding Ranger back, heart steady. Behind the hedges, a scream shattered the night, and I knew before the lights came on, before the neighbors poured outside, before the sirens, the hearing was about to become irrelevant. because Karen had finally learned something no HOA rulebook could protect her from. Nature doesn't negotiate. By the time the first animal control truck skidded to a stop, half the neighborhood was already outside. Porch lights snapped on. Doors opened. Phones rose into the air like reflexes. Everyone could hear it. The crashing inside Karen's house, the shrill screaming, the thud of something heavy hitting the floor. Karen burst out onto her lawn, barefoot, robe half-tied hair, wild face streaked with sweat and mascara. Behind her, raccoons poured through the open sliding door like smoke escaping a fire. "This is sabotage," she screamed, spinning toward the crowd. "He did this. He lured them here." She pointed straight at me. I didn't move from behind my fence. Animal control officers rushed past her nets and cages, clattering eyes wide at the sheer number of animals inside the house. One of them stopped short, staring at the open gap along the fence line. "Why is this open?" he asked sharply. Karen talked over him. "Because it violates HOA rules. He refuses to follow standards. This whole thing is his fault." Neighbors started murmuring, not agreeing, questioning. One officer turned voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ma'am, were deterrents removed from this property recently?" Karen froze for half a second. That pause was all it took. I stepped forward just enough to be heard. "Yes," I said. Twice. Every head turned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I held up my phone and tapped the screen. The video played clear, bright, undeniable. Karen, the HOA truck, bolt cutters, barriers stacked. Her pointing. The crowd leaned in as if pulled by gravity. That opening, I continued nodding toward the fence gap, leads straight from the woods. The raccoons avoided my yard both times because my barriers were intact. They followed the opening created by the HOA. An animal control supervisor stepped closer, watching the footage again. His jaw tightened. "So, you were warned," he said, looking directly at Karen, "and you ordered removal anyway." Karen shook her head fast. "That's not what this shows. You don't understand HOA authority. A crash cut her off." Another raccoon leapt onto the kitchen counter inside her house, knocking over a lamp. The officer turned back to the crowd. "For the record, this behavior is consistent with displaced wildlife following an accessible path. Not random, not provoked." A neighbor spoke up. "They didn't touch his place. Not once." Another added, "She forced him to take it down." Phones kept recording. Karen's control was slipping, and everyone could see it. Karen snapped. "This is a witch hunt," she yelled, voice cracking. "I was protecting property values. I did my job." A man from the HOA board stepped forward, one I recognized from the hearings. His face was pale. "No," he said quietly. "You went beyond your authority." She spun on him. "You approved it," he shook his head. "We approved a review, not forced removal, not trespassing." Animal control finished securing the last raccoon. The yard fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by Karen's breathing and the distant hum of engines. A county deputy arrived, notebook already open. "Ma'am," he said, calm but firm, "we're opening an investigation into property damage, endangerment, and unauthorized entry." Karen laughed once, sharp hollow. "You can't do this. I run this HOA." The deputy didn't blink. "Not tonight, you don't." The board member cleared his throat. Effective immediately, Linda Marlowe is suspended pending review. The word suspended hit harder than any shout. Karen looked around at the neighbors, the officers, the cameras, the open wreck of her home, and for the first time, no one looked away. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "This isn't over." I met her eyes through the fence. "It already is." As officers guided her aside to take a statement, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Conversations buzzed low, and urgent disbelief mixing with something else, relief. Behind me, Ranger leaned against my leg, calm, steady. For years, Karen had ruled Hunter's Ridge with rules and threats. Tonight, in front of everyone, that power collapsed, not because I attacked her, but because she ignored the one boundary that actually mattered: cause and effect. The street didn't rush back to normal after the last animal control truck pulled away. It went quiet in a different way, lighter, like something heavy had finally been lifted. Neighbors lingered instead of retreating. Conversations started where silence used to live. A couple of people crossed the street toward me, stopping just short of the fence like they weren't sure they were allowed to speak yet. "You tried to warn her," someone said. "We all saw it." Another added. No anger, no cheering, just acknowledgement. Karen's house sat behind the hedges like a crime scene, windows, dark doors, taped muddy paw prints, still visible through the glass. She stood off to the side with the deputy arms folded tight around herself, no clipboard, no commands left to give. Ranger pressed into my leg, steady and calm. His breathing was even. For the first time, since the barriers came down, he wasn't scanning the woods. He knew it was over. Across the street, a board member cleared his throat and spoke loud enough for those nearby to hear. There will be a full review. Tonight made that unavoidable. No one argued. People started drifting back to their homes slower than usual, like they didn't want to break the moment. As they did, a few looked back at my fence, not with suspicion, but understanding. For the first time since moving here, I didn't feel like the outsider behind it. The legal fallout arrived without drama. A county official stepped aside with me near my driveway and put a call on speaker. Clear voice, direct language. The HOA's actions were under formal investigation, unauthorized entry, property damage, endangerment involving a service animal. The words carried weight because the evidence did. Karen's suspension was immediate, unanimous, no debate. Outstanding violations tied to her enforcement were frozen pending review. Any fines connected to the barrier, removals were voided on the spot. The board committed on record to reinstating homeowner safety measures and prohibiting unilateral enforcement without written notice, third-party review, and homeowner consent. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't an apology tour. It was accountability delivered cleanly right there on the street where the damage had happened. The official ended the call with one last line: "Sir, you acted within your rights. You should never have been put in this position." I thanked him and pocketed my phone. Behind us, Karen was escorted to her car by a deputy, not arrested, not dragged, just reduced to what she'd avoided for years: a private citizen. She didn't look back as the door closed. As the crowd thinned, the board member approached again, this time without a title in his voice. "We're installing wildlife barriers along the woods," he said. "Proper ones. HOA funded. Starting tomorrow." I nodded once. "That's how it should have been." He hesitated, then added, "We'd like your input only if you want it." I looked down at Ranger. He met my eyes, tail giving a slow, easy wag. "I'll help," I said, "as long as it stays simple." When the street finally emptied, I closed my gate and leaned against the fence. Dawn was breaking properly now, light spilling over the trees, catching the mesh and the posts that had started all of this. The woods were quiet, no movement, no eyes watching from the shadows. Ranger lay down at my feet, chin on his paws, completely at ease. I stood there a while, breathing in the calm I'd been chasing since the day I moved in. Not silence, peace, the kind that comes from boundaries being respected instead of tested. Karen had ruled this place with rules and fear. In the end, it wasn't a confrontation that stopped her. It was reality pushing back. Some lines aren't meant to control others, only to protect what's already yours.